Today, we want to talk about something that may be a little bit different from the technical discussions that typically go on at a conference like this, and that is bridging in this commercial concept. And what we've seen over the last multiple years, is that commercial deal leaders are really seeing this risk, what we started off as just calling cyber risk, and now we're starting to get deeper into those types of risks. And we need to figure out how we address it. How do we manage it? How do we mitigate it? All these types of things. And so about a year ago, started looking into what is risk. And there were a tremendous amount of articles out there basically saying we've got things like cyber risk, and it was just one bucket. We've got things like M&A, and it's just one bucket. It's all great. We're seeing a lot of movement forward. But where we're at today is we need to really take a step back and properly place the type of cyber risk with the type of M&A. And so today I want to talk about parsing those out a little bit more. And so from cyber risk, we can think about it as your traditional IT cyber risks, but we also need to be thinking about it specifically as your OT cyber risk as well. And then mergers and acquisitions, we need to separate out. Not all M&A is the same. And so we can flip those into about three main buckets. The first bucket being a technology company buying a technology company. And in this case, typically what happens is if the tech's not good, the deal doesn't get done. So you're really focused on a lot of the deep diligence. It makes or breaks the deal. The next is a company buying a company where technology is a critical part, but not necessarily going to kill the deal. And that splits up into two as well. You have first your traditional IT technology risks, things that you might see more of social media tech company, or things that you might see of a financial services company, where they're really worried about your traditional IT-related risks. But then you have a whole nother category of M&A, and this is the one we really want to focus on today, which is acquisitions of physical assets, critical infrastructure, things like energy, which covers oil and gas and power, as well as industrials and others. And so why is this becoming a big piece, and why is the commercial side of the house starting to come in and want to understand this a little bit more? And so we see first and foremost that business leaders and technology leaders agree that there are significant risks in cyber when it comes to an acquisition point in time. And if we look at what this would have been years ago, could be less than 10%, depends on what study you look at. But now we see a good majority of companies are starting to realize this. And one of the biggest reasons that they're realizing this is because over 50% of these deals are seeing some type of critical cyber issue or incident during the M&A deal process. And so when that happens, you really start to gain the attention of not only the management, but also the deal teams. And the reason this is because there's a lot of money at risk. And traditionally on the commercial side, you think about risk differently. You think about it as maybe commodities risk. So what happens if prices go down or prices go up by 10, 20%? What does that do to my return of this asset? What does that do to my pricing of this asset? Likewise, you may be, especially now, be thinking about inflation. What does inflation do to my input cost? How do all of these things change the way that I'm dealing with this opportunity? And then on the back of that, how do I mitigate it in the process? What do I do? And the OT side really has started to come up of asking the question in the deal room of what happens if my asset goes down? And the impact of an asset going down, even for a short period of time, has, in some cases, just as big of an impact as a 5-10% decrease in price or some rise in inflation. And so because of this, it really starts to get attention not only at the deal team level, but at the management and the board level. And so because of this, we see that the threat actors are also looking at this as a unique point in time. A lot of discussions, again, are around what happens during normal run and maintain situation. And from, the deal side, the world I come from, we're seeing a whole bunch of different things. We're seeing articles come out about attackers targeting in the acquisition points in time. We see other articles coming out around the number of threat groups are growing, the number of threats are growing. And it really took some time to say, why is acquisition a different point than traditional run and maintain, and why should we be focusing on it as part of the traditional deal process? And in some discussions, kind of landed on three main things that we'll talk about today. By far, these aren't the only three things, but I think the ones that are worth talking about. And so first and foremost is acquisitions are typically very easy to find. They're typically done with a press release. For those of you wondering, can we just solve this problem by not doing press releases? Probably, but that's not how deals work. And so what happens is it's out there. And so now you've got an easy identification of an acquirer and of a target. And the second piece of that press release, of it being easy to find, is there's large capital involvement. So not only have you said, hey, this company is buying that company, you've also said there's a lot of money coming to the table that has a vested interest in the asset operating as it should be, growing as it should be, and all these things. But the third is the most important, which is it is a point in change, and it is a critical point in change. And for anyone that's ever done an acquisition or been part of an acquisition, it's probably one of the most chaotic points in time for people to try to figure out. And so when we think about assets during the acquisition versus normal run and maintain, we also have to think about why are they different? Why are the procedures, protocols, processes in place that we have for normal run and maintain different at acquisition? How should we think about them differently, and what should we do? And so we can parse these out a little bit more. The first is visibility. And we talked about visibility in the sense of easy to find. But the second part of visibility is in an acquisition, you have groups coming in and basically assessing all aspects of the business. You need to know what you're buying. You need to know what's out there. And because of that, you have external groups, management, basically shining a spotlight across the entire organization to figure out what is going on. And that's typically done in deep diligence, assessments, things like that. But ultimately, it's a different set of exposure that you have as leaders. The second is a different group of stakeholders. So for the groups that have really figured out their organization, how do I get the right management in place, bought into the programs we have, bought into these technologies that we're trying to implement, largely, again, in the good case, that's familiar. You know who those people are, you know how they think, you know how to position things to them. During acquisition, you have two additional groups. One is the deal team group. They'll come in and then they'll disappear. And then the second is a whole nother set of stakeholders in the other company. And if you're the ones being acquired, those are going to be the individuals that are making the decision of where do we invest, how do we mitigate, all these types of things. And so because of that, you have two views. In the best world, they all come together and it makes sense, but more often than not, there's differences. And those differences create some complexity within the type of risk that's being managed. You may have people moving from one organization to another. You may have changes that typically you're not used to dealing with in that normal run and maintain situation. And what that does is it creates this group of risks that somehow we need to get better control of. And not only do we need to get better control of it, we also need to figure out how to mitigate it or manage it somehow. And the fourth piece here, and this is more, I guess, a byproduct, is in the companies we've worked with in the past, in the articles we read in the market, we see that attack frequency during that point of acquisition starts to increase. And so we know that others are paying attention as well. And so thinking a little bit more about what is the deal process and who's involved and how do you mesh these things together, we've got to then take a step back and say, okay, this thing called a deal. So for those unfamiliar, you've got a deal, that's the actual transaction. Oversimplify it by saying you have a period of time beforehand, which is the pre-deal, period of time afterwards, which is post-deal. Traditionally, what happens is, again, if you're buying an asset that's done for strategic reasons, the decision to execute that deal is largely going to move forward, regardless of the issues raised from a technology team. Unless it's really, really bad, that deal is going to go through. And so what happens is there's this thing called integration, which is done in post-deal. That's when the technology teams get a call. That's when the vendors get a call and they say, hey, we've already made the decision, we're doing it, it's going to be a mess, go figure it out. And that is the point of time where there's an open window of risk. And so we need to figure out how do we bridge that gap earlier into the deal process, connected into the right types of stakeholders, that way it makes that transition easier, it makes it smoother, and something more sustainable. And so to do that, we've got to first think about who's involved. And so we have a set of commercial folks. These are strategy, new business development type people. And they're largely around the pre-deal phase, thinking about why do we want to buy this asset? Why is it strategic that we have a pipeline leading up to this refinery in terms of the business reason? On the back of that, you have your finance folks. And in your finance area, you've got your tax professionals, treasuries, controllers. Same with legal. And then you've got this group of other people, and those are health, safety, and operations, and so on and so forth. And for the largest time, there's been this concept of, and you also have technology people. And coming from the finance side, that to me is crazy, because in finance, you don't just have finance people. It's known the function of a tax person. It's known the function of a treasury person. And they all have a seat at the table. They all are trying to manage different things, and they're all integrated into that process much earlier. That way, again, post-integration, they can do something about what they've found, or they can do something about the pieces that they have in place. And so what, from a deal team's perspective, we need to do, and from a OT professional's perspective need to do, is really take a step back and say, okay, it's not just cyber risk and M&A. We need to think about it as, what do we actually need to do as that next step? And the first thing is separating IT from OT, particularly in what we're looking at in diligence lists. And I'll say this, from the diligence lists I've seen, typically you have a laundry list of commercial, finance, legal items. Technology, if you're lucky, sometimes it just says they have a technology department, maybe they have a CISO in place, they've got some procedures. It's a check mark that gets the deal done, and again, everything's pushed to post-deal integration. And so we've got to better tailor those solutions to actually itemize, what are the assets out there in the field that we're acquiring? How are they protected? Have those discussions much earlier in the process than we are today. And the reason we need to do that is because the risk during acquisition has real-world impacts. And so again, talking more to the energy side, let's take the example of midstream companies. These are companies that are consistently bought and sold, whether that be by a large corporate or that be by private equity firms. And these assets out there, at a high level, have a bunch of different supplier component partners. They have different vendors. They have multiple systems out in the field. There's different levels of sophistication, posture, reporting, all these types of things that now you have to merge into one. And that period of time where you're trying to merge them into one really creates a set of risks. And those, I think, for this group are very well understood types of risks. That might be things like operational loss of control, operational visibility, all these items. But from the commercial side, that's not really ever understood. It's just there's this risk, somehow it will be managed. And so we've got to think about, when we do these steps, when we get into these risks, how do we manage those? And the reason we need to figure out how to manage those is because the impacts are real. And the impacts may not just be about the risk exposure, regardless if that's unmanaged risk exposure, or regardless if that's unquantified risk exposure, but also things just like unplanned spending or delay of timelines. And so traditionally what happens in these is you have a process on the M&A side. And on the M&A side, you just kind of run that process. It's well understood, again, pre-deal, deal, and post-deal. What I want to do is talk about the set of actions that we can look at from a commercial team bridging into an assurance and handover process, something more familiar to the OT side, and what a set of actions and how we need to address these to move it from beyond just, hey, there's cyber risk, we need to do something about it. And so the first set of actions really starts when the deal starts. And I know this is probably the furthest along, this is the ideal state, but having a set of technology, OT cyber risk related discussions right at the beginning of deals being done. So as the deal teams are thinking about strategy of what types of companies do we want to buy, why do we want to buy them, what types of cultures do we want in terms of people, all these types of things, we need to have some type of posture or hygiene reviews of what are the types of things that we're looking for. And this is really getting into the mindset of the deal teams themselves, and then bridging that gap over into the technology groups. And the reason that this is important is because once that process starts, it allows you to get into the discussions much quicker and get to a place where you know what's going on. Again, the worst case scenario is just coming in at the integration, creating all the risk. And on the back of that, we see then moving into a deal. And it's important for those, hopefully everyone knows this, but when you see one deal announced, that likely means tens or hundreds of deals were assessed to get to that one deal. And so there's a lot of understanding as we go find that particular deal that happens in terms of the due diligence phase of mergers and acquisitions. And when mapping the due diligence phase into kind of an understanding of what's out there, the closest action that we can think of between an impact assessment and remediation step into the due diligence phase is doing some type of OT risk assessment. So understanding what is out there. And a lot of times we need to be able to bridge what are these things with then to the deal team of what should we be focusing on. Because the fact of knowing there's a laundry list of problems becomes challenging. We don't know what to mitigate against. We don't know which ones we should prioritize. So when we think about this OT risk assessment, it starts to do a couple things in the way that we communicate between technical organizations and commercial organizations. The first is understanding where to focus. So the concept of something is red is great, but is it a really, really bad red, or is it not as bad of a red? You don't know. And so there needs to be some type of understanding of how do we rank these, because I know as part of the deal we can't attribute a solution to all of them. So what are the ones we really need to be worried about? And then beyond that, what are the best ways that we can quantify that? Is it a big unknown risk that we need to find a solution for, regardless of how we mitigate it? Or is it something that we can live with? And we may make different decisions throughout that deal process of how we want that to work. And so on the back of that, it moves us to the next piece of the deal process, which is negotiations. And so we can't know what we're negotiating for, again, unless we've done an assessment, unless we've prioritized what we need to go solve for. And on the back of that, we know the value of it. And for some things that we won't know the value of, we'll figure it out, but that's part of the negotiation process. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because there can be a set of risk-related provisions and mitigations that are put into the deal to help with these different types of risks. Because inherently, when a risk gets identified, it exists. And we have choices of what we can do with that. We can try to reduce it, which obviously is a good thing. We can, as two parties, figure out who holds it. Well, the thing that is important here is there's actually three parties in an M&A deal: the acquirer, the seller, and someone else. And that someone else may be, hey, the solution is we're going to buy an insurance policy to cover this. So we're shifting that risk between parties. And within that, we need to understand what that means. We've seen, again, over the last year, 2 years, these types of provisions becoming more and more important in the deal. The latest legal documentation that I saw showed about 70% of deals have some type of cybersecurity representations in them, which mean that you as a company are representing to that acquirer that there are no known cyber issues, that there's certain things in place, and if you breach that representation, then typically there's something that comes back on the back end. Now, there's new solutions that we see coming to market. Some of those are getting more traction than others. You could buy reps and warranty insurance, assuming that might fit what you need. You may put it into provision of the deal where you claw back some money if something goes wrong. But ultimately, something needs to be done with it. And this is the most critical part of a deal team looking at it and saying, we need the OT teams to help us understand what that risk is. We need to quantify that, and then we need to put something in place. And if we can really get that active, then again, it moves the conversation from, hey, we just did this deal and there's a bunch of stuff out there, go figure it out, into here's what we're going to do next. And that what do we do next really sits in the next part. And this is actually pre-announcement, so these are things you would put in prior to an announcement. And so in traditional private equity-based deals, a lot of times corporates do this as well. They have something that's called a 100-day plan. It's a plan of how do you integrate. The great people can actually integrate in 100 days. Most people get nowhere close. And what we've seen as the industry looks more at the space is different numbers of, from the point of transaction, how many days until you actually find that there's been a problem. And in the SEC's recent proposal of more disclosures in the space, which we'll talk about in a second, I think the number they used was like 44 days in terms of identifying a breach. And when you look at a 100-day plan, you're halfway through at that point. So the question is, how do you actually get a plan in place of this is how we're going to transition? That transition could be a transition service agreement, where you say we're going to keep on these folks for a period of time to transition, train, and otherwise. But there needs to be something in place for that transitory period, because we know that resourcing is typically a challenge during this time. The uncertainty of job security and where everyone lands and who reports to who is important. And so having a plan out there that allows us to then integrate into this 100-day plan, traditionally used on the deal side, is really, really critical. The other thing that's important is not only from the technical folks that are managing the assets themselves, but also all the vendors. And I know there's a lot of vendors here today. And what happens is if you've got duplicate systems or things that may work together, you just sold into an account and they're now getting acquired, then there's naturally always going to be a discussion, especially in this integration process, is what do we keep? What do we spend on? How does all this work? And traditionally what you'll see is the decision saying, well, I don't want to remove anything, because if I remove something, then that might create a hole and then that gets me in trouble. And that may be true for a period of time. But the problem is that can't sustain forever because, as we all know, there's not unlimited budgets. And so it's really kind of figuring out how do all these pieces come together and how do we put a plan in place. And then how, as we're integrating and moving to kind of what do we do about it, how do we kind of keep up on that? And so very similar to an OT risk assessment, having some type of a OT health check that says, okay, we have a 100-day plan. Halfway through, hopefully there's no breach, but that's long short of when we'll figure that out. And we need continuations, which then get us further into multiple checkpoints. And so we can think about this as a module that taps in to that 100-day plan and becomes more consistent. And then on the back of that becomes a connection tool that goes through ongoing threat visibility and reporting to senior managers and directors. And when you get that, what you've done is you've created cohesiveness from this pre-deal process into the deal, now into post-deal. You've positioned right alongside the commercial teams. And then on the back of that, you've kept focus within management and boards. And what we're seeing is that management and boards are now raising more awareness because there's more coming back on them. And so, talked about or referenced a little bit before, what we're seeing now in things like the SEC's proposal around security disclosures, it's a handful of things. It's things like, do you have a procedure in place? Do you have policies in place? But there's a couple really critical ones as it pertains to what is your board's level of knowledge around cyber risk, and what is management and how is management involved in these types of risks. And nothing gets an individual or a group more active than accountability and responsibility. And so we're seeing these types of things start to come in a little bit more. And it's a natural place to then bridge these gaps. And again, this gap of communication of the OT side or cyber risk side as a whole, getting split into IT and OT, deals getting split into physical assets, not only the commercial side, through the deal process, but post-deal, creates a really good platform to keep those conversations going. And so on with that, the question is really, where do we go from here? And so the first thing that we need to do is work together. So we need to augment the traditional deal teams with OT cyber security stakeholders. Again, this can't be a situation where right at the end of a deal or towards the end when it's in place, there's really nowhere to figure things out. We just say, hey, it's your problem now, go figure it out, and hopefully don't screw up the returns that we expect. It's not going to get the outcomes we need. So pulling that earlier in the process, having those communications come into play is really, really critical. And sometimes that's just being able to speak a common language. Other times that's just being able to know who the people are. The second piece is to set a common set of benchmarks. So I know there's a lot of standards and procedures and things like that on the cybersecurity side, but really create ones that are fit for purpose around the specific risks that are created in the deal environment. So what are the things that we need to be thinking about that's not traditional run and maintain? That is, as companies are transitioning from one technology team merging into another technology team, one group of assets, systems, vendors merging into another groups of systems and vendors, and create a common, let's say, framework or way that those pieces can work together. And then the third, I've touched on this a lot of times, and I'll touch on it one more time, is we have to assess early and often. So we've got to really go in and integrate these concepts into the deal framework. And when we do that, what it does is it gives us the capability on the back end to start as deal teams pricing in the residual risk. So no longer is cybersecurity just this thing that exists. It's a thing that we somehow do something about in a deal. And so that means we need to, again, identify it. We need to understand it to the best of our abilities to wrap our arms around it. And then we need to start putting that into some type of value. And then with that value, impacting the deal itself. And that impacts potential valuation metrics, ways that we think about putting money in escrow, ways that we think about insurance, all these types of things. We need to translate traditionally what is green and red and orange and things like that into specific clauses, actions, and stuff that we can use to protect. And that's really the last point, which is we've got to revise the traditional contract terms. And we're already starting to see this happen. Again, we didn't see cyber reps and warrants the same way 5-10 years ago that we're seeing now, and we're going to see that continue to evolve over time. And we need to think about a more creative set of solutions beyond just saying accept the risk or ignore the risk or put all that on one group to figure out. We need to be solving that from legal perspective. We need to be solving it from commercial perspective. And we need to be solving it from insurance angles. We need to be looking at how do we give the commercial side a connection into the OT side. And so with that, what it does is it puts us in a position to say, if we can do all of this, then it puts us all in a better spot. And what it really helps with is saying, this is no longer just cyber risk in M&A. We now understand it. We're taking it a step further. We're taking it a step forward to say it's OT cyber risk in energy M&A deals, and this is how we deal with it. Or it's OT cyber risk in industrial companies, still manufacturing, other things like that, and this is how we deal with it. That way we can get the right solutions in place and protect the ultimate goal of the transaction, which is to have a consistent, solid handover, generate good returns with the least amount of exposure as possible, and just be able to achieve ultimately the right visibility within the organization. And so with that, it definitely takes the efforts of both the technical side and the commercial side. It's great as a commercial individual being able to come to an event like this where there's a lot of great technical experts, and look forward to continuing the conversation of how we bridge the two sides together to create a better outcome for both. Thank you very much.